Welcome, everyone. My name is Darlene Hyde. I'm chair of the McGill Women in Leadership and Philanthropy for Vancouver, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this today. I would like to acknowledge the land of the Coquitlam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Stolo First Nations that I am on today, and I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the unceded traditional territories you reside on as well. We do this to recognize and express gratitude to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for the land that we live on. So I'm a graduate from way back when, from McGill. I'm, as I said, currently chair of the Women Leadership and Philanthropy Group of Vancouver. I've been a promoter and a supporter of McGill for many, many years, but I got involved with the staff from the development group at McGill about this initiative. So this particular group in Vancouver is very pleased to welcome you to this virtual space today. We're a group of McGill alumni working across many fields, business, law, music, and more. We're thrilled to announce the launch of this group this fall, and our goal is to connect McGill alumni within the Vancouver region, facilitating the exchange of information and experiences and inspiring and learning from each other. We are promoting leadership through meaningful engagement opportunities such as these, as well as showcasing philanthropic opportunities that both resonate with and have a direct impact on women within the McGill community. So on to today's event. We're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel of McGill alumni in Vancouver here for our discussion on equity in the pandemic. Please feel free to submit your questions for them through the chat feature. And leading the group in this conversation is Professor Angela Campbell, Associate Provost, Equity and Academic Policies at McGill. Professor Campbell is a full professor at McGill's Faculty of Law, where she's been a member of faculty since 2003, and since 2015 has served as McGill's Associate Provost, Equity and Academic Policies. In this latter role, Angela is responsible for oversight and flourishing of faculty life, as well as all equity matters at McGill. In consultation and collaboration with the McGill community, she developed and currently oversees the implementation of McGill's first Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Strategic Plan for 2020 to 2025. She is also committed to ensuring a rich and inclusive environment in which all members of the McGill community feel welcomed and capable of success. Angela, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Over to you.
Thanks, Darlene, and good afternoon, everyone. So I am speaking to you from Montreal, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory on which I am working today and learning today. So McGill itself, our campuses, are on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And I want to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. So it's my honor and pleasure to be the moderator for today's distinguished panel, and I'll introduce our guests in a moment. I just want to take a quick second to thank Darlene for underlying the strategic EDI plan of McGill University, which is a really exciting initiative for our university. We've just completed the first year of implementation of that strategic plan, and one of the things we're going to be talking about today is both the challenge and the opportunity of advancing EDI work within our organization. So I'm really delighted to be here for this conversation. And I want to acknowledge in particular the hard work that's been done by our panelists today, and you'll get to know them a little bit more. And I've had a chance to have some preliminary conversations with some of them already, and you'll see the passion and dedication that they bring to their work. So we're really lucky to be able to share this time together this afternoon. So I'll introduce each of the panelists and then we'll launch straight into questions, but please do send in your questions in the chat as we go. So I'll start by introducing Sarah Boatman, who is a graduate of the Faculty of Engineering and Chief Financial and Operating Officer of Photonic Inc. Sarah oversees the financial vision and operating strategies to drive Photonic's sustainable growth. She's a strategy, finance, and business development expert with corporate and startup tech experience. Prior to joining Photonic, Sarah was on the senior leadership team at Microsoft Studios in Vancouver as the Director of Business Development and Strategy. Known as an inspiring leader who builds inclusive teams, Sarah fosters a growth mindset in every organization she leads. Our second panelist is Aftab Arfan. She is a graduate of Urban Planning, a Master's of Urban Planning program in 2005, and she is the Chief Equity Officer for the City of Vancouver. Aftab is a long-standing scholar practitioner in the field of inclusion and social justice, currently serving as the first CEO, Chief Equity Officer of the City of Vancouver. She was educated as an environmental scientist at UBC and then on to having an urban planning studies degree in 2005. In 2013, Aftab completed a PhD in community and regional planning at UBC, where she subsequently taught for a decade and completed a 4-year stint as Director of Dialogue and Conflict Engagement for the university. Aftab is a first-generation Iranian settler on Coast Salish lands who has worked as a facilitator and teacher on 4 continents. She is cautiously optimistic about the future of humanity. And last but certainly not least, Julie McGill, who is a graduate of our BCom program in 1999 and is the Chief Investment Officer of JTR and Company Investments and founding partner of the Women's Equity Lab in Vancouver. Julie is an experienced private equity and venture capital investor and board director with a 20-year track record of bringing together people and resources to successfully scale private and not-for-profit organizations. She's an entrepreneur in residence with BDC's $200 million Women in Technology Venture Fund, a founding partner of Women's Equity Lab in Vancouver, a director at Blue Shore Financial Credit Union, and the founder and CIO of her own private investment firm. And Julie was named one of BC's most influential women in business in 2019 by BC Business Magazine. So a real honor, as you can see, and distinction to be sharing time together this afternoon with these 3 amazing panelists. And to get to know them a little bit better, we're going to start off with some questions. And I'm going to ask each in turn to allow the audience to get to know each of our panelists a bit better, to invite each to share with us in brief their journey until now. So it can be a journey that's personal, professional, or a combination of both. And I'm going to start with Aftab.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. Maybe I'll start at the end, which is that I'm sitting here at my home on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory in Vancouver. I come from Iran, as my bio says, so that's really kind of the beginning of the journey. I grew up until at the age of 14 in Iran, and then my family moved to Vancouver, and then I lived elsewhere in Canada and came back. But maybe just to say a little about my journey into the equity and inclusion work, I got very interested in the issues of sustainability, I was an environmental activist really in my 20s when I was at school. That was kind of, those were the circles where I was hanging out, and then went into planning, thinking that was a very solid way of kind of putting into action some of our aspirations for the environment. And then once I got into planning, I became really interested in social issues. And so I've sort of ended up as a social planner, and was at UBC for a while in a teaching role, and then in an administrative role in the Equity and Inclusion Office. And now I'm running the Equity and Inclusion function for the City of Vancouver. I'm a mother of 2 kids. I live in a kind of an intergenerational building. My parents actually live on the 2nd floor of the building, where I live on the 5th floor. And so there's a kind of keeping a lot of the ways that I actually grew up in Iran, but it's like transported into Vancouver. So I definitely live in that context of my bigger family and community, which seems to be actually really key to the way that I do the work that I do right now. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'll go to Julie.
Sure, thanks. Thank you for the kind welcome and for everybody for being here today. So I'll start the journey. I grew up small town Nova Scotia. So I've gradually worked my way west across the country, and I would say, like, dropping into Montreal for someone who lived in a pretty small rural community, dropping into Montreal was like having an explosion of cultural experience, and I thought it was so fantastic, and I couldn't wait to continue to absorb more of that. So I think that's sort of the first place where I had my eyes open to what I didn't know. And it's been a journey since then. So I graduated from McGill, as my bio said, in '99 with a BCom in finance, and I thought I was going to go to New York and be an investment banker like everybody else in BCom finance, and the markets were terrible that year, and recruiters didn't really even come, and so I had to have a backup plan. So my backup plan, I figured accounting was not where my passion lie, but I knew it was never going to be a tool in the toolbox that I would regret having. So I started my career in professional services, and I worked at small, medium-sized firms and did the minimum amount of time I could in audit to get my CPA, and then I moved on into the transaction advisory group, ending up after a stint in Yellowknife. I landed in Vancouver in 2001 and worked at Ernst & Young. And you know, I thought professional services advising clients, like you get to see a broad spectrum of things, but what was really sort of the next learning journey for me as I followed some of my clients that were private equity clients, I was always more interested in what happened after the transaction. So investing in businesses at that moment where they're just about to grow and scale, how do you resource that? Like, how do you work together teams? Who do you need to have on the bus with you? It was really exciting to me. So I moved into investing about a decade ago. I spent time with a very traditional private equity buyout fund. We used debt and bought mid-market size businesses, which is the majority of businesses in Canada. And in recent years, as technology has become part of every business, I became more interested in on the venture side of the spectrum. So these days, I invest across the spectrum personally. I like working with companies across the broad spectrum because I think the difference between a bricks and mortar and a technology based business, like it's still a business and it's growing, but there are some fundamental differences in how people operate in it, which I think is really interesting. But for me, the journey through having been in the shoes of people who need capital and the people who are allocating capital, what I see is when I look around me, and I've seen for the whole decade I've been in investing, is that there's not a lot of people that look like me, and I'm probably, as a white woman, the closest to having access to that systematic place. And so to me, when I think of like who should be the team on the bus helping companies grow, it's a business imperative that it's a diverse team that's inclusive. And I don't think everybody's quite there yet. So, and the results say it. So less than 3% of women-led companies get venture financing. If you look at the websites of private equity funds around this country, usually you'll see a woman in the role of marketing, investor relations, and maybe the CFO. There's not that many professional GPs who are women. And those businesses that they are investing in touch all of our lives. So to me, you've got to have more, not just gender diversity, but much broader diversity if you want the capital allocation to be allocated fairly. Because, if I exit my career and there's still more white 6'1" men named Dave that are CEOs of Fortune 500 companies than there are women, I feel like we haven't moved forward, but I think we are making progress. So I share Aftab's cautiously optimistic that we are making headway. And the more people that engage in the discussion and the journey, I think the more normal inclusivity will come around all the tables that we work at.
Super. Thank you so much, Julie. Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Boatman. Thank you for having me today. I grew up in Vancouver. I'm born and bred here. I loved playing with Lego. I loved Star Wars. I was really interested in math and physics growing up, and that led me to a degree in mechanical engineering at McGill. And then from there, I moved to Toronto and worked as an engineer for Honeywell. And at that time, that was my first experience with a company deliberately trying to hire for diversity. So at that time, they were making a deliberate effort to both bring in new grads and also women engineers. And I benefited from that. It was a rotational program, and they were looking for potential and leadership potential. And it was a great first experience, and I was well supported in that role. And after that, I left Honeywell. They were pretty sad after investing in me, but I decided to make a change and go to business school and leave engineering behind. So I did an MBA and majored in finance. had an investment banking job lined up in New York, but turned it down because I had teamed up with 3 people and a PhD from MIT. We wrote a business plan which won the Harvard Business School competition, and we had a lot of venture capital interest. We ended up raising $10 million from Sequoia Capital, and we moved to San Francisco and started a new business. So that was an incredible experience again, and early in career to have kind of that exposure and opportunity. I really enjoyed that. Unfortunately, it didn't end so well. September 11th, 2001 came along. People stopped investing in new technology. I headed back to Vancouver after that and ended up in the games industry. And again, was really fortunate to be identified by some of the leaders within that organization and was put into leadership development programs. And they were, the leadership again was looking for diversity in their organization, and I benefited from that and had some great training there. I left again to do a startup, which again didn't last very long, but this one ended more successfully. We were acquired by Microsoft, and I moved to Microsoft and took a leadership role there, where we then grew that studio into an organization of over 400 people, and I spent 12 years there. I've recently left Microsoft in a very comfortable position that I was in by then to join another startup, this time as the CFO and COO, and it is in the quantum computing space. So it's a whole new industry for me. I left gaming where I'd been for 15 years and now in quantum computing, and it's super exciting and super challenging all at the same time. My experience at Microsoft was super interesting, having been there for 10 years and having gone through the cultural change of that organization is something I'd love to share with this panel. But it was a really interesting time to be there. It went from very much of a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. It went from a culture that didn't value diversity to one that was starting to value diversity. It was I learned a lot being there. And I'm really excited about the opportunity I have now at a new company to take what I've learned about the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion and build that into the values of the new company.
Okay, that's amazing. Thanks so much. So 3 really different stories, but what's remarkable as a thread that I was just thinking about, Sarah, as you were saying final remarks in your presentation, is just the incredible courage that you've each displayed in kind of forging paths forwards and making changes that resonated with your own values and goals. So I think that's really inspiring and fantastic. So each of you talked about your own link to and commitment to questions around diversity tied to social justice to some extent. But if you had to describe why EDI or equity matters to you, what would you describe as the motivator? So perhaps this time I'll start with Sarah.
Right. I think, as I said, I think I benefited from people wanting a more diverse workforce. And so I want to give back in the way that I was given opportunities. I really believe in giving others opportunities. I mean, as a business person, I fundamentally believe in the value of diversity and the different perspectives and what it brings. So from a business perspective, I've always thought it's important. But I've also had challenges along the way. I have bumped my head into the glass ceiling on occasion, and that's really challenging and something that I want to lift others up. So in my time at Microsoft, I had the opportunity to manage teams and grow teams and work with really talented individuals there, and was able to think about the value of diversity on those teams. And that's been just really, it's always really important to me that we have different perspectives around the table and that we provide opportunities.
Super. Julie?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of Sarah's sentiments there. I think I am the beneficiary, and I stand on the shoulders of generations of women that came before me. I didn't have to fight to vote. I didn't have to fight to get to go to college. I did not have to fight to have access to a high-paying job that allowed me to start building my own financial independence, which to me was a really important message that was instilled to me, like, since I was a very small person, and maybe that's just rural Nova Scotia upbringing. You better be able to pay for yourself. but that, I think a lot of women, we hear a lot about income inequality, but I spent a lot of time in the last few years thinking about the wealth inequality. And when you look across the different layers of wealth inequality and what that's going to mean for people long time in their retirement and their comfort and all of that sort of stuff, like it starts to become really troubling how big the gap is between the folks that the system was built by and for and everybody else that's not part of it or not welcomed into it in the same way. And so to me, I think, what I see at this point, and I think, the social currency that EDI movement has right now, I think we're just starting to get into the hard work of it. So I think conceptually, I think majority of people are good people and they want to do the right thing and they want to move things forward. So there's somewhere in the spectrum of what they know and moving towards like the good side of it. And I think if you don't know what you don't know, figuring out how to meet people where they are and bring them over to the good side, so that some of those unconscious bias things that we all have for different areas, but we all have them, that we can start to move on from that. And I think that's hard work. And I think it goes past the rhetoric of press releases and throwing big pots of money at it and like throwing like marketing campaigns at it. Like, I think we're starting to get into the real work of how do you make it be a priority, not the thing that happens off the side of your desk when I have time for it. It's a business imperative. It is front and center, and it's everybody's job. It's sort of like at a manufacturing company, safety is everybody's job. It's not the safety person's job, it's everybody's job. Inclusivity is everybody's job, and we all need to figure out how do we help people move along the spectrum. And gender is the place where I've spent a lot of time thinking about it because it's my lived experience. There's lots of lived experiences I don't have, and I hope, as I express my desire to learn, people will meet me wherever I am and help me on the journey and not, bonk me on the head when I put my foot in my mouth. And I think that's sort of the place we are. People are open and people are listening. So if we want them to come along on the journey, we can't bonk them on the head when they, say the wrong thing or stick their foot in their mouth. We've got to bring them along.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Aftab, how about you in terms of your own sense of like, where does the motivation come from?
I want to thank Sarah and Julie for expressing what you have. I mean, I think the kind of business imperative and the benefits to innovation, I mean, that is well documented now. And I think the other really important imperative actually is legal. Our rules of society are at a level where just to comply, we need to be doing a lot better than we are doing right now. And so that's a big motivator, I think, organizationally. Just very much more personally, I come from a place of having experienced discrimination and just like being really aware of that, especially when my family first moved to Canada and kind of moving into a school where I definitely felt invisible, right? Either invisible or like super visible, and kind of being bullied and not having any teachers that look like me, like all of that. So I think somehow I hit the right strides and met the right mentors, and something really worked for me. But I am so aware of, I think Julie is saying, the system has been made for some of us, and then there's so many other who are falling through the cracks. And I'm really aware of the people really at the bottom. I mean, in Vancouver, we have such a a visible disparity between the rich and the poor, if you will. You know, the fact that you go to the downtown east side and there are people who like literally cannot pull themselves out of poverty, and they're, you know, overwhelmingly racialized, they're overwhelmingly indigenous. I mean, I think to me there's something very wrong with that picture, right? So the imperative of justice, you know, seeking the moral imperative, I think is probably the driving one for me. Like I cannot rest in a society where we have this kind of disparity, and where, you know, how you're born, the family you're born, the skin you're born into, the gender you're born into, determines to such a big extent who you become. Like I just think, how did we end up with that? I know how we end up with that, but it's like, how do we undo that? How do we reverse that? How do we rebuild our systems? And then I might just say, on a day-to-day basis, there's actually something really exciting about that project. You know, you're really thinking about redesign of institutions, redesign of cultures, redesign of the way we're doing things, redesign of society. Like, what an amazing project to be a part of. So it's also just very energetically, that's how I'm carried on a day-to-day.
It's so exciting to listen to all of you, because my own work is different. So being in a university context, which FTAB has worked in before too, over at UBC, but at McGill it's really similar. So when we do sessions with faculty, because we do a lot of training of faculty, I always start with, you know, why are we here, right? So what are the motivations for thinking about equity? And all the things you talked about are things that we articulating as driving forces. So the question of social justice, the question of the legal requirements and the norms there are getting ratcheted up and shifting all the time. And we as a public institution have obligations to meet, both to our internal communities, but to external entities as well. But then probably the most compelling one is just the business case, right? So the idea that if we are not being mindful of the barriers to access to and success within our institution, we're missing or potentially inadvertently weeding out talent. And that is a huge miss for all of us, not only at McGill, but more broadly. And so it's really exciting to hear also the way in which you've articulated the challenges, which really resonate with me, but also the excitement of the transformative quality of the work. So with persistence, and that means that we do the work all the time, not just when there's moments where we're being held to be publicly accountable for organizations, but all the time, the heavy work. And it can be sometimes really tough going, because there is quite a bit of resistance that we'll encounter along the way, as we know, but it means that we've got to be perseverant and also undertake it with a huge amount of humility, right? Because we're coming at this not for the first time. There's others that have been doing the work for a long time, well before us. So I want to talk a little bit now about the kind of topic that was advertised for this this webinar, which is the pandemic, and get your thoughts a little bit about the way in which EDI and equity have intersected, particularly in relation to gender, but it's not, of course, just gender, right? So it's said that COVID-19 has affected all of us, but we haven't all been affected the same way. And there have certainly been disparate impacts for different individuals and different communities and their members. So each of you is a leader, and I would ask any of you, and I'm not going to go in a particular order, I'll just ask whoever wants to jump in first. In your view, what is your sense of the role and responsibilities that leaders have in different organizations to attenuate adverse outcomes, and when those adverse outcomes are engendered or perpetuated by social or economic disadvantage? Why does leadership matter?
I'll jump in on one that
Sure.
that somebody said this to me a long time ago, and it's sort of been rattling around in my brain since, is that if you want leadership to look different than it currently does, then it's not about getting people to try to fit themselves into the list. It's about changing the list.
Mm-hmm.
The things that matter, like who do we ascribe the leader role to? You know, I think historically it was confidence, and it looked a certain way and all those things. And one of the things that's come out of this pandemic is that empathy has become such a more important attribute of leadership. And some of the folks that are in leadership roles that look like the traditional version of are really struggling with that idea of what it is to have to be, to shift into something that felt uncomfortable to you, to shift to be more empathetic than you were previously. So if you're this leader of an organization, whether you're the CEO or the top of your group or whatever it is, that flexibility is different for everybody, but everybody needs flexibility. Like that is the common thread in it. And where economically, like the K curve, like some people have come out of this economically far better off than they ever were before. And most likely the group that didn't need to come out, didn't need for, like they were already comfortable to start. And then the groups that have been so dramatically affected, I'm with AFTAB, like we can't look away from that. Like if you're on the top side of the K curve, it's not okay to just say, well, I'm good. Like having empathy for the folks that have had their lives like ripped apart by this, whether that's because you're a small business owner or you didn't have childcare, or your community has been dramatically impacted by the health side of it. Like we've got to figure out how to have empathy beyond what our little world is. And I hope that's one of the things that comes through it, is that we don't lose empathy afterwards. Like we don't remove empathy from the list of things that we want to see in a leader, that becomes a change in the list that we see that sticks.
Yeah.
So I'm super interested to hear AFTAB's answer to this question, actually, because I think she's dealing more on the front line with it certainly than I am. So
yeah, I'm sort of wondering what I'm going to say to this question. The first thing actually that came to my mind was in BC, we've had a very interesting case of a leader in front of us, Dr. Bonnie Henry, who's the public health officer, has been kind of leading this whole coping with and hopefully transitioning out of this pandemic. To your point, Julie, I mean, I think, I know this is somewhat controversial, because of course you can't be a public leader and not have people critique you, and there are people who hate her, and there are people, but this kind of very steady, giving people lots of information, leaving a lot of choice in a way, only bringing down the hammer when we really need it, and this sort of like treating people as adults, I've so appreciated about her. And I think what I'm seeing work in my organization is a similar kind of approach of actually not trying to, well, in a way, it's like we don't know. There's so much certainty that it's very difficult to know what the right answer is, what the equitable answer is. But approaching it with that kind of humility, as you say, Angela, and sort of, I find like giving a lot of information about what's going on. Why are we trying to do it this way? What is the drawback? And then monitoring how it pans out for people. The most convincing pieces that I've read about equity and this phase now of coming out of the pandemic is like, we don't really know how it's going to land. We better be monitoring really well. Who's benefiting, who's deciding to stay home, who's deciding to come to the office. Are the people who are coming, who are staying home, less likely to get promoted because they're not in the space? Like there are all kinds of considerations like that we don't really know, but it would be really important to keep an eye on. And then I would just say, because the kind of organization that I'm in is very interesting. I've never been in a place like this, but City of Vancouver has about 10,000 employees, and about a third of them are operational frontline outside workers. So it's like the people who pick up the garbage, and it's the community center folks, and it's people who had to come to work during the pandemic, and they're already on the margins in so many ways. And so I think it has really brought to light that distinction between those of us who are desk-based essentially, and maybe to your point, Julie, like most of us have been fairly comfortable and maybe benefited and didn't have to go, and maybe our houses prices went up, like who knows what happened with us. But there is there is real divide between the people who had to risk their lives at some points to show up and continue to run the city in this case. And so I think I'm feeling so much more appreciation of that discrepancy, and in a way, you know, it's somewhat easy to sit at the top of the organization and think about you know, the little bits of discrimination that other women in my level or other leaders are experiencing, but that's not where the major discrimination is. And I think it's been important for us to look at that other piece. And we are a living wage employer at the City of Vancouver, but it's obviously not cutting it for what is needed to live here. So yeah, I think there's no easy answers about that, but that socioeconomic gap, I think we need to be thinking about as part of our discussions on equity. And this is the way in which, like, this discussion up to now has mostly benefited women and mostly white women, and what has it done for the working class folks and for racialized people, and then that's where we need to go next, I think.
So important. Thank you so much. Sarah?
Yeah, I found this question very challenging, and you know, from my perspective, you know, what I've seen through the pandemic is a lot of mental health issues. So I think from a leadership perspective, you know, back to Julie's point around empathy and what can and what should leaders do, I think what I'm taking away from this experience is the need to be more empathetic, to understand the mental health issues, to understand the challenges individuals are facing, and then as a leader provide both the space, the flexibility, you know, and demonstrate the caring, and try to give space for it, and know that, you know, people will do their best work if they feel heard, if they feel supported, if they have kind of what they need. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, it reminds me, my new colleague, who is the Provost's academic lead and advisor on McGill's Anti-Black Racism Action Plan, Professor Terry Givens. She's a political scientist, and she has her most recent book is called Radical Empathy, and it's great. And she runs a series of workshops tied to the book. And her notion of radical empathy not only underscores that the empathy is the most important quality for leaders and members of any organization to be able to bear, but also the radical piece comes with respect to the action, right? So the importance of not just sort of being empathic or empathetic, but also acting on empathy, right? So it's one thing to learn and to be able to share experiences and to listen, but then act consequentially. And so that is just so important, and it's active leadership too. So I find that incredibly helpful to think through as we all push forward in our own organizations on this front. I'll just take a second to invite members of the audience to continue sending in their questions. So some are coming in. I'm gonna just go to one other question and then take a look at the chat once more. So I would ask the panelists to talk a little bit about a time where you faced a challenge in your career that you surmounted, and talk a little bit about how that happened, if you're willing to share. Julie, you look like you want to go, or maybe I'm misreading.
No, I'm happy to go, but I was going to let the others have the floor first. So you posed this question to us a few days ago, so I've had a little time to think about it, and I won't be specific about it, but I've had the experience sort of twice in two different ways, and I didn't put a word to it until the second time, and mostly because it frankly surprised me. So I didn't know what the word gaslighting meant until the second time I experienced it. And it's this feeling of working within this team, and where, you know, at one point I was a little bit more junior in my career, and the second time it happened, I was more senior. But it's this feeling of being like, I was part of this team and it was all running and humming, and that's my favorite work environment to be part of. And then all of a sudden something felt weird, and stuff was happening, and I was getting like feedback that didn't quite make sense to me. And it's having the experience where someone else, and each of the reasons why it was happening, it took me a long time to think this, to sort of land on this. Their issues were their issues, not my stuff. But at the end of the day, I was the one being impacted by their stuff.
Right.
And having that, like, things that you know to be true, things that you were confident in about your abilities, all of a sudden you start questioning them. And it felt like, sort of like when you gain weight, like it sort of comes a pound at a time, you don't notice it until you step on the scale and go, whoa, how did I end up here? And so the second time I experienced, I had a lot more control about what am I going to do about this, because there was a decision point very directly in front of me. And it was an attempt to bully me in from exiting the situation with zero. And because of the nature of the work that I'd done, you know, in transaction advisory services, often people are fighting about stuff. So you learn how to put stuff in place to protect yourself when you're going to be in a moment of fighting about stuff when it doesn't work out. So I'd protected myself pretty well of like, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, because it was not a low risk venture, but if it doesn't work out, how are we going to amicably exit? Because to me, win-win on the way out, like you win a little, I win a little, is always sort of how I like to approach negotiations. But I wasn't working with someone who wanted to value that. So I was working with someone, or against someone, I guess, really, who I win by you losing.
Right.
So it took a lot of talking myself through, is this worth it to have this fight? And if it's not worth it to have the fight, then I'm going to save myself a lot of mental health by just calling it a day. And I've done that before, where I'm just like, economically, the dollars associated with this, like I don't need to be right for this amount of money. I need to be right for this amount of money. So it took a lot of time, and like I said, lots of walks and lots of thinking through, and quite frankly, lots of leaning on the community of people that I do trust. That was about the moment where I introduced a coach to my life, because I couldn't wrap my head around of like, everything I knew was this, but I'm getting all this feedback of something that's very opposite of that. And like, it really helped me to work through getting to the other side of it. So it's, you know, I'm happy to say that, you know, I don't think I'll be going out for dinner with that person anytime soon, but, but I've landed on the other side of it with, I think, good perspective of, there was value in the relationship, like, and the work that was done. It didn't end well, but I'm not going to dwell on the ending piece of it. And I stood up for myself. And I think I've counseled a lot of women, and I've advised a lot of women who get in a position where there's a business transaction where they're being bullied, or being made to feel worth less than they are, and they leave that on the table. And I have the ability, based on my background, skill set, to be like, no, this is what it's worth, and this is enough for you to stand up for it. So I was able to do that for myself the same way I've done it for other women. So I think that was up there on something I am proud of. I wish it had never happened.
Sure.
but I'm proud with how I showed up and worked through it, and you know, I probably still bear some scars on it on the other side. But you learn those from the tough things.
You do. And I think learning how to balance like what's pragmatic and what's principled, right? So we can't fight all the battles. And so there's got to be some smart decisions that come with experience and maturity. And so it's tough, but those are, like you said, you kind of wear the wounds a little bit still, but at the same time, there's a benefit that gets yielded from the learning.
What
Sarah,
I think was probably insult to injury of it was like, the person I was being gaslight with is someone who's done a very good job of putting themselves into the community as like,
oh yeah,
pro women power. So like,
oh yeah, that exists,
the
right?
thing about it was just like,
yeah,
that's why I didn't see it coming. Like,
right. No, for sure, and that's one of the big risks of doing equity work. Okay, so Sarah or Aftab, any thoughts on, well, maybe sharing your own obstacles and how you surmounted it?
Yeah, it's interesting because mine is a similar situation. I think the one I was specifically going to share was when I had joined electronic arts, and I had they didn't really know what to do with me. I didn't really fit a traditional role there, and so I spent a bunch of time doing some project work, and then I was moved over to the finance side of the organization and assigned to a general manager to be their finance partner. This general manager was great and very welcoming, but there were a couple people on his leadership team, and one in particular, I guess, that didn't think I belonged there. So didn't see the value of me, and made it really clear to me that I didn't belong, I wasn't skilled, and that, that I had got, effectively, I'd gotten this role because I was a young woman. And he was extremely confrontational and very condescending, and which made my life challenging. But I'm not sure why. I did have the maturity to recognize that it wasn't my issue. It was his issue. I was well supported by both my manager on the finance side and the general manager. And with that support, I was able to deal with this peer. I kind of put my head down. I was very respectful with him, and I did the job. And before long, he came around, and we had an effective working relationship. Now that was a while ago in my career, and I look back on that and I think, what would I have done differently, now with what I've learned and with my experience, and what would I suggest other women do in that situation? And in this different environment that we're in, I think there's an opportunity now for that just not to be acceptable. While I did mention to my manager I was struggling with that particular peer, I never called out the behavior as what I believed it to be, right? And so I would hope that I could tell my younger self now to make sure that isn't okay, and that person is is educated, I guess.
Yeah, so hard though, right? Especially when you're starting out, just it takes a ton of strength just to get through it, right? So having to shoulder also the burden of the education, like that's why I think allies are so important, having someone else who can step in and do that work. Aftab, thanks, Sarah. Aftab.
Oh, I got so many examples coming to my mind as you folks are talking now. I don't know what to, I mean, I have to say, when I first saw the question, the first thing that came up for me as the obstacle that I've overcome was postpartum depression, which is, of course, not work related, but of course impacted really how I showed up at work and everything that was going on in that period in my life. And I wish I could say, I think the way out of it for me was spin class. So there was something chemically that needed to happen, but I think it's a very real struggle for a lot of people. And I'm glad that we've already touched on mental health in this panel. Really important. The other one that I might share, and there's been so many examples of it, but I think it's a really important dynamic working in the equity realm right now, is that so I see myself as working on behalf of people with less power. So at the university, it was the students. In the city, it's like workers who are struggling to find their place or be included. And I'm finding that very often I get criticized by that very group. So there's and it's often very sharp. And I mean, with the students, it was the worst, because they were all up on the language and they've read the most recent books, and I'm never doing anything right enough, fast enough, perfect enough. And I think there is a kind of it's very tough to be in that situation, because it's sort of wrapped up with my identity as a person, as like my mission and what I'm all about. And so to be faced with that kind of criticism, the first couple of times that it happened was pretty shattering. And yeah, I had a coach, I had a therapist, I had my spin class, like all the different possibilities of how I can get help. just to sort of maintain myself and regulate myself. And I think over time I've come to realize that it's a, I mean, first of all, that there's some truth in what these folks are saying, that there's something they're saying that's actually spot on, but because I go into such a state of defensiveness and protection, that I cannot see that for a while. And so I think I've become a little bit better at going more quickly to that place of, okay, you know, they're accusing me of this, that's not true. Like I'm not the slave owner here, or like the colonizer or whatever, but is there something that I said or done that's a little bit colonial, right? You know, is there something that I've said that's a little bit racist? You know, like what is it in what they've said that I can own and I can use to adjust how I'm working through it and how I'm moving forward. And then the other piece has been recognizing that different people also are on different parts of their learning and their journey, and there's, you know, a younger version of me would have probably criticized the 40-year-old version in front of me in a similar kind of way, and it's part of that phase of, well, being righteous, really, and, you know, like having a view of the world that needs so much boostering and protection that you have to sort of fight for it in this very militant way. And so I just also like finding a little bit more compassion for that role, that I don't have to become crushed by it every time that I meet it, that I can sort of learn what there's to learn and move on, because it's there's no point sort of getting stuck in that place either.
You've touched me so deeply, because that is my world, and
Yeah.
I find, so I feel sandwiched sometimes between, so I've got a lot of the, you know, because of you, my sons are never going to have jobs, and I have 2 sons, and, you know, I hope that they are employed gainfully at some point, and so I find that challenging, but also I'm more easy to kind of say, I can live with that. But when I get the, you know, neoliberal performative bean counter from, you know, the activist group, that touches me in a way that is so different, right? Because I feel like I've disappointed the community that I've been appointed to serve, and so that is really hard. And I also resonate in many ways at a personal level in my younger self with that group. And so it's much tougher, I find. So I guess maybe just as a final, we have only a few minutes left together, which has gone, time has gone by so fast, but there was actually a question in the chat, I think that was directed at me, from a panel or a participant that is sort of committed to equity, an alum, proud alum of McGill, but also having a hard time reconciling the fact that there's a sense that this member of the audience has, that McGill has not done enough to protect compromised members of the McGill community, particularly, I guess, with the return to campus around COVID. So a sense of disappointment, right? So if you had to kind of sum up in kind of one sentence, how do you live with or persevere in the face of disappointment? When you let people down, how do you stay positive when you're doing this hard work? Maybe I asked too hard a question before we close.
I don't know that I have much to add to what I've said, except to say, you know, like, I find it somewhat helpful to actually be in touch with my own disappointment. You know, it isn't moving fast enough. It is, you know, like people are really suffering in this moment, and every decision that we make, it's not our fault that it's putting people in danger, but it is doing that, right? It is having these consequences. And so, yeah, I find that somehow if I'm not, it seems to be easier on me if I don't have to like pretend that everything is awesome and like, you know, be all cheery and championy about it. Like it is actually really hard work. Every decision that we make is like disappointing in so many ways, because we are living in the real world and doing this real work. Yeah, anyway, and then, you know, see your therapist and go to
and a coach.
Yeah.
Julie or Sarah?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, as you guys have said. Like, you can't please everyone, and I'm so admiring of folks that put themselves into the public sphere, because you're going to take all that criticism. And like, a lot of my work can happen sort of in behind the scenes, not on the front facing of it. But you know, it doesn't mean that you don't have conversations or events where you know that your best version of yourself did not show up.
Yeah.
And so I think I spend my time, you know, going easy on myself, because I know myself that I am well intentioned. But if I still fall flat, that doesn't mean there isn't some work I should go back to do. Be like, okay, so what would my best version of that look like? Because that's not what I delivered on. So let me do the work on it. Similar to AFTAB, like, what is that kernel of valid truth in what they're saying, is what I try to look for. But you know, I think moments where I've gotten myself up in my head about, you know, some specific thing, I have to step back and say, okay, what's my stuff and what's their stuff, and there's some balance in between those things. That that's sort of where I go when I start to get anxious about disappointing in a
Super
exchange.
Thanks. Sarah, last quick word over to you.
Yes, I've definitely had that experience where I haven't been able to. I've disappointed others in this, you know, journey and work that we're doing together. And for me, it's, you know, it's staying curious. It's trying to understand that perspective, and you know, and keep a growth mindset and try to learn from it. So.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to thank all three of the panelists. Sarah, AFTAB, Julie, you've been great. I've learned so much, and I found this really exciting. The time flew, and I'm going to turn it over to Darlene to close us out.
Well, thank you, Angela, AFTAB, Julie, and Sarah, once again for such an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I can tell you those shared experiences were very powerful and they resonated with me. We're so pleased that you could join us for this event and for the journey, the bigger journey. Thank you all again, all attendees, for coming. You can connect with the McGill Women Leadership and Philanthropy Initiative and expand your network through our LinkedIn group found in the chat. We look forward to connecting with you afterwards for further information on how to get in touch with us if you're interested in the work of the McGill WLP Group of Vancouver. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you at our next event.